Tantor Audio presents Enemy Coast Ahead, Uncensored, The Real Guy Gibson, by Guy Gibson, VC, DSO, DFC. Narrated by Simon Vance. Special preface to the 1998 edition by Air Marshal Sir Harold Martin, KCB, DSO, DFC, AFC, who flew on the Dam's raid with Guy Gibson. It is good to see again in print Guy Gibson's vivid account of his wartime flying, covering over 170 operational sorties. In his introduction, Sir Arthur Harris makes clear the extraordinary courage, ability and leadership that put Gibson among the greatest airmen this country ever produced. Here we have Guy Gibson's personal account of the attack on the Ruhr dams that won him the Victoria Cross. There have been a number of other attempts to record this exploit, some good, others contrived. The German reports were confused and often inaccurate. This is the way it was. Gibson worked early on with Sir Barnes Wallis, took part in the trials, chose and trained his squadron, and on the 16th of May 1943 he magnificently led us. Guy died on the 19th of September 1944, returning from acting as master bomber on a raid on Reit. He crashed in flames near Steenbergen in Holland, where he is buried in a grave lovingly tended by the Dutch and unforgotten by all who knew him. Mick Martin. Introduction. This is a magnificent story, well and simply told by as great a warrior as these islands ever bred. It is also history. Guy Gibson was not a professional airman. He joined the service in peacetime because he wanted to learn to fly. War supervened, and he remained an airman until his death in action. His natural aptitude for leadership, his outstanding skill, and his extraordinary valour marked him early for command, for great attempts and great achievements. His personal contribution towards victory was beyond doubt unsurpassed. In every facet of his character he was a thoroughbred. He was not only admired, but loved by all who knew him. In this book he tells of the bomber's work as he saw it from the necessarily somewhat circumscribed viewpoint of an individual cog in a vast machine, as commander of a flight and later of a squadron. Guy Gibson fought from the first days of the phony war, phony because we had nothing to keep fighting with, until his death. He lived to see the dawn of certain victory, and no one man did more to bring it about. He would not stop fighting. He resisted or avoided all efforts to wrest him from operations. For his first rest, he asked to be transferred to night fighting, and as a highly skilled night pilot he was of great value to Fighter Command in raising and training the night fighting force, which eventually defeated the Blitz. To enforce a second rest on him, I had to make a personal appeal to another warrior of similar calibre, Winston Spencer Churchill, who there and then ordered Gibson down to Chequers and took him with him to the United States. There he arranged for Gibson to be detained for a short period of travelling round air bases to talk to American airmen. In a third and final effort to force him to rest from operations, he was put on his group's staff. A few days later, he was found in his office with, literally, tears in his eyes at being separated from his beloved crews and unable to go on operations. It was in fact breaking his heart. He always had direct access to me, and on further pressure from him and his AOC, I quite wrongly allowed him to return to operations. He appointed himself Master Bomber, the most dangerous and most vital task of all, on his last operation, which was, of course, a complete success. He was heard to give his crews a pat on the back over the radio and start them homeward. He never returned. Throughout the story, something is indicated of the difficulties of obtaining the means and the equipment which, during the last 18 months of the war, enabled us to find and hit ever smaller objectives under more and more difficult conditions. That is another story, of the wonderful achievements of our scientists, which will some day, I hope, be written. The difficulties were immense, but they were overcome. No one did more than Guy Gibson to overcome them. It may well be that the references to parties and drunks in this book will give rise to criticism, and even to outbursts of unctuous rectitude. I do not attempt to excuse them, if only because I entirely approve of them. In any case, the drunks were mainly on near beer and high rather than potent spirits. Remember that these crews, shining youth on the threshold of life, lived under circumstances of intolerable strain. They were, in fact, and they knew it, faced with the virtual certainty of death, probably in one of its least pleasant forms. They knew, well enough, that they owed their circumstances to the stupidity, negligence, and selfishness of the older generations who since 1918 had done little to avert another war, and even less to prepare for it. If, therefore, something of cynicism was occasionally manifest in their attitude to whatever might remain to them of life, and if, on occasion, the anticipation of an event, or the celebration of a success and an unexpected survival called for a party, for the letting off of steam in an atmosphere of eat, drink, and be merry, for next time we shall most certainly die, who, amongst the older generations who sent them, and tens of thousands like them to their deaths, will dare criticize? If there is a Valhalla, Guy Gibson and his band of brothers will be found there at all the parties, seated far above the salt. Arthur Harris. Forward and Dedication. In writing this book on the past 4 years of war, I have had to work without notes and without help from diaries. I have never kept a diary because I never even dreamt that the lot would fall to me in 1944 to try to describe the work of air crews in bomber and fighter squadrons. The fact that I have been extremely lucky to have survived must go without saying. Only a few will disagree, and they don't know. But I hope that living people who have served with me will forgive me if I have left them out, or worse, put words into their mouths which they never said. A memory is a short thing, and flack never does it much good. However, the aim of this book is to illustrate the growth of a small baby in 1939 to the awesome colossus that it has become today, the growth of Bomber Command. Not only in size and bomb capacity, but also in accuracy, it has achieved immense proportions, and has now reached the stage, perhaps the ultimate state, when whole industrial areas, or single factories, can be wiped off the face of the earth in a single night, despite weather conditions and despite opposition over the target itself. In admiring the air crews who are now engaged in completing the destruction of the Third Reich, we must remember that their lot, side by side with the American daylight crews, is to wage the toughest war of all. The losses, in percentage in any one air raid, are not unduly high, rarely above 10%. But remember, this used to go on for some 60 missions, and the bare fact remains that out of a squadron of 25 crews, not many are left at the end of 3 months. Well, these boys know all this, and yet not in the slightest degree does it deter them from pressing home their attack with the highest possible sense of duty. In fact, they are proud to be members of the only offensive team bringing the war home to the Germans, inside Germany itself. These boys have got guts, and they must have, or they never would be able to do the job. Nor must we forget the ground crews, who make these raids possible by their untiring efforts under very trying conditions, nor the squadrons and the groups, and the WAF, the WAAF, and the clerks, the Ministry of Economic Warfare, the directors of bombing operations in the Air Ministry, and Air Chief Marshal Harris himself and his staff. And perhaps, above all, the scientists and MAP backroom boys who have made such progress. It will happen that by the time this book is published, new events will be taking place in Europe. New place names may be appearing in the headlines of our daily papers, and the role of the heavy bombers may even be changed to that of tactical necessity rather than strategical. If that is the case, then let no one forget the work done by home-based bombers during the dark years of 1940, 1941, 1942, and 1943, who alone fought the enemy on his own ground, and alone stand as one of the mighty factors that have brought about the changed war situation. All-powerful in war, let the bombing forces be all-powerful in peace over Europe. Then, when one task has been done, the yellow skies of Japan will hear the same dreaded hum of thousands of aircraft American and British, the same crump of bigger and better blockbusters and the rattle of cannons. And the Japs won't like it. To dedicate a book of this nature is not easy. Many different people are involved. Above all, I should like to mention the wives, the sweethearts and the mothers of all crews operating from this country against Germany. Peace and war are vastly different, but the atmosphere our crews live in is shared by their next of kin. One moment they are together, living their own lives and happy. A man and wife, walking hand in hand down a country lane, may in a few hours be separated, perhaps forever. True, sailors leave home for the countless dangers of the seven seas, but their people have not got a television set which can see them every few days, dive-bombed, torpedoed, undergoing the hardships of war on the sea. Those at home worry, but they don't know, and they don't want to know. A soldier in the front line, it is true, lives in the turmoil of battle, but his girlfriend does not see him every week, grimy, unshaven, stepping over the dead bodies of his comrades to advance another few yards. His people cannot see him doing his job. But picture peaceful England on a cool spring evening. The flowers are blooming, the hum of serenity is in the air. Suddenly there is a snarl of 4 motors, and a few hours later your airman is fighting the hell of flak and destruction over the target. At home they wait, brave and patient, asking the same questions again and again. I hope he gets back all right. When are they due? It is grim for them, grim and terrible. For this reason I should like to dedicate this book to those at home, my wife, your sister, his brother, the girlfriends, and the mothers. But I know they would say no. They are brave people, and like all brave people they would have it no other way but to turn their heads aside and say, give this book to them. I therefore dedicate this book to the boys who have not been so lucky, who have given all they can give to their country for freedom's sake. Let us never, never forget them. Chapter 1. Flight Out. The moon was full. Everywhere its pleasant, watery haze spread over the peaceful English countryside, rendering it colourless. But there is not much colour in Lincolnshire anyway. The city of Lincoln was silent, that city which so many bomber boys know so well, a city full of homely people, people who have got so used to the Air Force that they have begun almost to forget them. A Lincoln, with its great cathedral sticking up on a hill, a landmark for miles around. Little villages in the flat fenland slept peacefully. Here nice, simple folk live in their bastions on the East Anglian coast. The last farmer had long since gone to bed. The fire in the village pub had died down to an ember. The bar, which a few hours ago was full of noisy, chattering people, was silent. There were no enemy aircraft about, and the scene was peaceful. In fact, this sort of scene might not have changed for 100 years or so. But this night was different, at least different for 133 men. 133 young flyers, and I was one of those men. This was the big thing. This was it. We were flying not very high, about 100 feet, and not very far apart. I suppose to a layman it was a wonderful sight, these great, powerful Lancasters in formation, flown by boys who knew their job. Below us, and also practically beside us, at 200 miles an hour flashed past trees, fields, church spires, and England. We were off on a journey for which we had long waited, a journey that had been carefully planned, carefully trained for, a mission which was going to do a lot of good if it succeeded, and everything had been worked out so that it should succeed. We were off to the dams. Those who have seen a Lancaster cockpit in the light of the moon flying just above the earth will know what I mean when I say it is very hard to describe. The pilot sits on the left of a raised, comfortably padded seat fitted with armrests. He usually flies the thing with his left hand, resetting the gyro and other instruments with his right, but most pilots use both hands when over enemy territory or when the going is tough. You have to be quite strong to fly a Lancaster. In front of him the instruments sit winking. On the Sperry panel, or the blind-flying panel as bomber pilots call it, now and then a red light, indicating that some mechanism needs adjusting, will suddenly flash on, and it is the pilot who tells the flight engineer what to do. The pilot of a bomber must know everything. Sometimes a little mist will gather on the windscreen. Then there is the need for the glycol pump. Sometimes the fuel gauges will light up green. Then he must inform the flight engineer which taps to turn so that all 4 engines get even power. He must know the duties of the rest of the crew inside out, and should be able to take any one of them over should the occasion arise. The flight engineer is the pilot's mate and sits beside him watching the engine instruments. Most flight engineers were ground mechanics of Bomber Command who have volunteered to fly on operations, and a grand job of work they do too. It is warm inside, and both pilot and flight engineer are very lightly clad, their oxygen masks hanging on one strap from the corner of the face. These masks are necessary evils. When over enemy territory they are worn continuously, not only because oxygen is required, but because the pilot has no time to take his hand off the wheel and put the microphone up to his face. The result is that one gets quite chapped after 6 hours with the thing on. Many times the question is asked, why can't we have throat microphones like the Americans? Between the 2 front windows is a large instrument, perhaps the most important of all, the repeating compass, worked by a master unit at the back. The pilot's eyes constantly perform a non-stop circle from the repeater to the ASI, airspeed indicator, from the ASI to the horizon, from the horizon to the moon, from the moon to what he can see on the ground, and then back to the repeater. No wonder they're red-rimmed when he returns. Such is the scene to imagine. The glass house, soft moonlight, 2 silent figures, young, unbearded, new to the world yet full of skill, full of pride in their squadron, determined to do a good job and bring the ship home. A silent scene whose only incidental music is provided by the background hiss of air and the hearty roar of 4 Merlin engines. In my Lancaster it was pretty warm, even though Hutch had turned off the heat. I was in my shirt sleeves and my Mae West. Incidentally, my Mae West was a German one, pinched off some fellow shot down back in 1940, and the envy of the whole squadron. The windows were open and a jet of cool air was blowing in, making a tremendous screeching noise. I yelled to Pulford, the flight engineer, at the top of my voice, "Close that window, for Christ's sake!" It had stuck, and I remember thinking it would not be so good if we pranged somewhere, because this was one of the main emergency exits, and also remembered to give Lofty, my rigger, a raspberry when we got home again. Pulford, a Londoner, who was a bit of a stooge, but a sincere and plodding type, was pushing and struggling and at last got the thing closed. Like the silence at the end of a crash, the noise snapped off, and we were in comparative silence. Then I spoke to Terry. "Where are we now, Nav?" "I think we're about a mile to port. I'll just check. What do you think, Spam?" Spam was the bomb-aimer, and it was some time before he answered, because he had taken off his parachute harness and was now picking up his position from a roller map. It looked like a roll of lavatory paper, but no matter what it looked like, it had to do a pretty important job. The job of that roll and Spam and Terry was to get us to the target. "Yeah, you're right, Terry. We're a little over a mile to port. There's the railway going to King's Lynn." Spam, the Australian, was the best bomb-aimer there is, but he was not too hot at map-reading, and Terry looked over my shoulder to check him up. Later he popped back into his cabin to make a quick calculation. Then I was told to alter course 3 degrees to starboard, and by the slightest pressure of the rudder the great Lancaster almost imperceptibly pointed her grim, blunt nose a little farther south, and the boys on either side did the same. After a while Terry spoke again. 10 minutes to the coast. We will be able to get a pretty good check there. We go slap over Yarmouth." Good boys, these, Terry and Spam. Flying Officer Terham came from Calgary, Canada. He had a soft Canadian accent, was well educated, and in love with a very nice girl, a waif from Ireland called Pat, probably the most efficient navigator in the squadron. He had done about 35 trips and knew what he was doing. I never knew Terry to lose his temper over anything, but sometimes he and Spam would argue the point over where they were. Spam, or Flying Officer Spafford, DFM, as his real name was, came from Melbourne, Australia. He was a grand guy, and many were the parties we had together. In his bombing he held the squadron record. Just before he had asked me if he could take off his parachute harness, because we were flying so low anyway that we would not have been able to bail out even if we had the chance. But that just illustrates what he thought of flying. It was just one big gamble, and he had put his counter on the right mark. Spam had done a little more than Terry, about 40 trips, and used to fly with one of the crack pilots in 50 Squadron. When he came to our squadron, I think he was a bit nervous of my flying, but he seemed to recover after his first few trips. Both had pretty good accents deriving from their respective dominions. I have, if anything, a southern English accent, which in the air sounds rather a drawl, with the result that when we, as the offensive team in the bomber, got annoyed with one another, no one, particularly ourselves, knew what the hell we were talking about, which was a pretty good thing anyway. In the back sat Trev, in the rear turret in Air Force parlance, and of all places in the bomber I think it is the most uncomfortable. He was in his shirt sleeves too, but later on pulled on his old teddy bear flying suit, not because it kept him warm, but because of its smell. All clothes which have been on a lot of raids have a smell, a peculiar but not unpleasant smell which shouts aloud to all bomber crews who are in the know that the wearer, or owner, whichever the case may be, is pretty experienced, a gen man. A wife or loving mother would send the thing to the laundry if she had her way, but you try to do that with the boys. As far as I can see, the stronger the smell, the better it is liked. Flight Lieutenant Algernon Trevor Roper, DFM, rear gunner, came of a pretty good family, and all that sort of thing. Was 28, English, Eton, Oxford, and 65 trips. He was one of the real squadron characters. At night he might go out with the boys, get completely plastered, but would be always up dead on time in the morning to do his job. He got his DFM for shooting down 2 fighters which tried to down him one night last year. Now his wife was living in Skegness, and was about to produce a baby within the next few days. I guessed he was thinking of this. Anyway, he was pretty silent, because he hadn't said a word up to now. He was probably thinking exactly what I was thinking. Was this the last time we would see England? Father Ford Hutch was in his place at the wireless. He had flown with me on about 40 raids and had never turned a hair. He was one of those grand little Englishmen who have the guts of a horse. On most trips he invariably got airsick, but after he had done his stuff just carried on as if nothing had happened. He was in love, too, with a girl in Boston. In the front turret was Jim Deering of Toronto, Canada, and he was on his first bombing raid. He was pretty green and not too good at his guns, and it was taking a bit of a risk having him, but one of our crack gunners had suddenly gone ill and there was nobody else for me to take. As I sat back in my comfortable seat, I could not help thinking that there were 7 men in a bomber bound for somewhere in Germany. 7 men, with wives and sweethearts, for all we knew sleeping in one of the houses we had just roared over. England virtually was at peace, but we were at war, the toughest, hardest war there is, the bomber war. I had been in the racket for some time, and it had become practically part of me, but when I thought of all the friends I knew who had come and gone, to be mere memories, a name on the casualty sheets in the Air Ministry or the scroll of honour in a squadron mess, then I shuddered. After a while I just sat back in my comfortable seat and relaxed, and dismissed these thoughts from my mind and concentrated on steering my course. Suddenly, in the distance, like a great arc drawn across the land by silver paper, came the North Sea, the sea which now seemed unfriendly because we were going the wrong way. I hoped it would look different a few hours later. And then Terry was saying, "Yes, there's Yarmouth coming up in front. That's right. Yeah, there's the harbour. Sure it's Yarmouth. That's it, all right. OK, all to course 110. 110, OK. OK." And our noses were then going straight for the point at which we had to cross the Dutch coast. The sea was as flat as a mill pond. There was hardly a ripple. Once we were over, we dropped lower and lower, down to about 50 feet, so as to avoid radio detection. I tried to put in George, the automatic pilot, but unfortunately it was US, and as I engaged it, the nose plunged forward and I just disengaged it in time. One of the aircraft on my left flashed me a red light as if to say, "What the hell are you doing?" Then I settled down again, but after a time tried to light a cigarette. In doing so, we again nearly hit the drink, and the boys must have thought I was mad. In the end I handed the thing to Pulford to light for me. The night was so bright that it was possible to see the boys flying on each side quite clearly. On the right was John Hopgood in M. Mother, that grand Englishman whom we called Hoppy, one of the greatest guys in the world. He was devoted to his mother and devoted to flying, used to go out with us a lot, get drunk, used to go out a lot to Germany and do a wonderful job. He had no nerves. He loved flying, which he looked upon rather as a highly skilled art, in which one can only become proficient after a lot of experience. He was one of the boys who firmly refused to be given a rest, and had done about 50 raids with me in my last squadron. Perfect at formation was Hoppy, too. There he was, his great Lancaster only a few feet from mine, flying perfectly steady, never varying position. Once, when training for this raid, we had gone down to Manston in Kent, and shot up the field with wings inside tailplanes, and even the fighter boys had to admit it was the best they'd ever seen. I should say Hoppy was probably the best pilot in the squadron. On my other side, flashing him a message with his oldest lamp, rather as ships do in a convoy at sea, was Mickey Martin. Mickey Martin came from Australia, and he too had done a lot of flying. He was slightly more split-arse than Hoppy, and flying to him was nothing unless it was dangerous. In fact, many times after a raid on Berlin or Hamburg, instead of coming back with the boys at 22,000 feet, he would scream down to the deck and fly home via Holland, Belgium, and France, shooting up anything he could see. That, to him, was a bit of fun, and something that he and his crew liked. However, tonight he had to be good and stick to the plan, because if he didn't, things would go wrong, and so there he was, flying dead level with Hoppy on either side. Now and again he would drop down even lower than I was, and I was a bit frightened in case he hit the drink, but apparently he knew what he was doing because he never came closer than 30 feet to the water. Further back were the rest of them, Melvin Young from America, leading Bill Astle and David Maltby, followed by Henry Maudsley, leading Dave Shannon and Les Knight, who were both Australian. This was my formation, and a great team they were. The sea was calm as I had never seen it before, and as Mickey got lower and lower on the water, I could see his reflection quite clearly coming up to meet him. In the north there is that bomber boy's bad dream, the glow. Some scientists call it the aurora borealis, but you ought to hear what we call it when there are fighters about. That glow never disappears in the summer. And this was summer. The hours of darkness were limited. We had to go fast to get there and back in time. There were no other aircraft operating in the whole of the home-based air forces. No one even knew that we were operating except for a few, and even they did not know where we were going. But deep down in the ground, 200-odd miles away, were the Germans. In their plotting rooms they sat, watching their cathode ray tubes, waiting for some indication that would set all their defences alert. The lower we flew, the closer we could get before they picked us up, but I knew that at a range of about 30 miles they would get us, even if our bomb doors clove a furrow through the water. Then their guns would be ready, then the fighters would take the air, then there would be a chattering and a babbling in the Observer Corps plotting rooms. And so Huns and Quislings would sit up late at night in sandbagged emplacements waiting for the roar of the Lancasters. Hutch was reading the message. "What is it, Hutch?" "It says we're going to get damn drunk tomorrow night." "Send him back this. You're darn right we are. It's going to be the biggest binge of all time." And then Hutch was busy flashing this message. Soon we passed over a little convoy who engaged us with the challenge signal. We quickly fired the correct vari-light before they opened up on us, and as usual they flashed us "good hunting." Hutch, who was as good with his oldest lamp as he was with his key, and who did not drink, replied, "We're going to get damn drunk tomorrow night." The skipper of the ship, whoever he was, did not reply, because he must have been wondering whether this was a code message, or else we, the boys on board, were nuts. As England receded far behind our tails, Terry, who had been quiet, had been working out our ground speed on the G-box, a special navigation instrument which shows the aircraft's position relative to the ground. He suddenly said, "There's no wind tonight, Skip, so we shouldn't have any drift, but we'll just check, so I'll throw out a flame float." Then he yelled to Trev behind, "Will you get a drift, Trev?" A little later Trev's voice was heard from the back. "OK, there's no drift. The flame float is about 10 miles behind. It's still straight behind my guns." So Terry was very pleased, and was able to get down to his calculations. Later he came up again and said unemotionally, "Our ground speed is 203.5 miles an hour. We will be there in exactly 1 hour and 10 minutes, 30 seconds. We ought to cross the coast dead on track, so everything's fine. Incidentally, you're 1 degree off your course." Navigators are funny chaps. They always think a fellow can steer a course to an absolute degree, and I smiled to myself as I swung myself back. Navigators have a union called the Navigators' Union, which is about the most powerful thing there is. Now they're even taking over squadrons, let alone being captains of aeroplanes, and anyway, I think they deserve it. Navigation is a tricky job.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?